Okay, I think we can start if everybody is okay with that. Okay, so my name is Patricia Živković and I'm lecturer in law at the University of Aberdeen, also a member of SCOTLIN, initiative that is also supported by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And I'm really honored to open this third enlightening talk that is going to be dedicated to the topic of online learning as a commons. Definitely a topic that we all find relevant, as educators, we were influenced by really fast shift to online platforms in the past 2 years. Now, scholars have warned about legal and social consequences of this quick shift, and we have our speaker today, Janis Wong, who will talk about some of the issues involved in it. The talk will be moderated by Catherine Nolan. Catherine, thank you for accepting our invitation. Catherine is a PhD researcher and a part-time teacher at the London School of Economics, and her doctoral research focuses on the role of the individual in EU data protection law. She will explain how the talk will move forward. And before I give the floor to Catherine, part of my duties is also to, on the organizational side, is to say that the talk will be recorded. And with that being said, Catherine, I'm glad to give you the floor to move forward with today's talk.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for that opening introduction. Hello, everyone. As Patricia said, my name is Catherine Nolan. I'm a current PhD researcher at the LSE. I'm delighted today to be introducing Janis's talk. Janis is a PhD researcher in computer science at the University of St. Andrews, where she's working at the intersection of law and technology and ethical approaches, particularly associated with privacy concerns. So really fascinating work. Janis is going to speak to us today for about 35 minutes or so, after which there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. And there's a facility through the platform to enter questions and answers, and I'm sure I might have a question or two myself. Janis is going to speak to us about online learning as commons. And so it's a really interesting opportunity for us to see how might a practical approach to collaboration or collective informational self-determination actually work? Because I think lots of us have concerns about how we balance these relational concerns in online environments, and now we get to see a really practical worked example of how that might be approached. And as Patricia has said, it's really never been more relevant given the pressures that have been placed upon learning platforms in the last 2 years. So without any further ado, I think I'll hand over to Janis for what I'm sure will be a really fascinating talk. Janis.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction and for everybody attending the talk today. I'm just in the process of sharing my screen. Great. So hopefully that is in view. Great. I guess it's moved on for me. But let me just make sure. Great. There we go. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about online learning as a commons and seeing how we can actually support the co-creation of data protection solutions through a collaborative digital environment. And as mentioned, coincidentally, the talk is timed quite well as we reflect on the past year of online learning during the pandemic and as it continues as well as students start coming back for a hybrid year. So a lot of things to learn from the past year, but still a long way to go before things turn back to quote unquote normal, if they ever will. So I'll first start off with this slide, and some of you may have seen this tweet online, and I think it really perfectly encapsulates a lot of the problems, a lot of the challenges that everyone's experienced last year. And this is quite an extreme example, but a real one, according to this Twitter user. But I think it really sums up the ideas about online learning, tutorial recordings, repurposing or reusing, resharing, academic documents for academic purposes, but also, the ethical questions surrounding that. And obviously there are a lot of questions related to university management and admin on this part. So hopefully none of you have experienced something to this extreme, but it does raise a lot of questions. And I want to highlight the online learning landscape that we've all been kind of living and breathing over the past year, and a lot of work has been done prior to the pandemic and in this space. So if we are first looking at education and data, Christine Borgman's work looks at how education data is described as gray data, particularly in terms of how it's not only students and staff in the community or university or education communities personal data that we're looking at, but how it intersects, for example, research data, administrative data, archival data, and how very often it's not really certain where the responsibility lies or where the overlaps are in terms of actually managing, sharing, and analyzing this sort of data. Of course, for those based in the UK, there's been strike action as well. So there have been questions about monitoring employees as part of institutions and the chilling effects of that on academic work. And there's also been a lot of research done on online learning pedagogies and methodologies, and how we can make sure that online learning is as inclusive and as accessible while still being innovative as possible. Of course, when we're thinking about online learning and protecting personal data in the digital education context, we can't not talk about the GDPR, but also a lot of policies in terms of universities' own data protection policies, guidance from the ICO about using online services, as well as JISC, and many more for guides for online learning, teaching, accessing resources, and lecture recording as well. However, even with a lot of these resources and laws and regulations in place, we're still facing a lot of online learning data challenges that have been particularly manifested over the past year. And here I've screenshotted a collection of some of the news articles that have come out during the past year over the course of the pandemic. Of course, many of you will be familiar with the A-level scandal of algorithms deciding grades, which has been completely scrapped this year, just over a few weeks ago now. But of course, there have been a lot of cases where staff feel monitored. There have been examples in the US in particular where local apps have been developed for track and trace purposes, and more close to home, lecture recordings or tutorial recordings being used to break strikes a little while longer ago, but also cases of Zoom or harassment and Zoom bombing and potential e-proctoring challenges there as well. So is this really kind of the online learning and educational landscape that we want? So hopefully not, but there have been solutions that have come out in response to that and reacting to those things. Cautiously kind of quoted as post-pandemic, but we'll see how long these things last and solutions are, and research, of course, is continuing to be done. So if we start from a technological perspective, Zoom have decided to enable end-to-end encryption. Of course, as some of you may be aware, that Zoom lost against class action in the US by saying that actually, the encryption that Zoom had employed wasn't really end-to-end encryption. So they had to pay out a good amount of money there. But even applications we use very normally, such as Microsoft Teams, it's difficult to remember actually that before private channels didn't exist and IT admin integration didn't exist when we first kind of entered the pandemic. And these are all things that were seen as solutions to certain problems related to our uses of technology when it comes to education, but also in the workplace as well. If we're thinking more from a policy or or guidance or strategy side, the Open Data Institute has done a bit of research on the impact of online learning on both children and teachers. And I also work as part of the ODI looking at data governance solutions for online learning as well. JISC have also, as well as the Office of Students, have also done a lot more on the groundwork to see the impact, particularly on higher education institutions and learning, and develop reports with a lot of testimonies and quotes from that. So I would encourage you to have a read of that to see not only what we've learned from the past year, but also moving forward, not just post-pandemic, but into the future of education for the few decades to come as well. And finally, particularly when we're looking at emergencies, we can't not talk about crowdsourced or public efforts in finding immediate solutions to some of the issues that people face. And the two examples I've listed here include a tech ethics and Zoom guide on how to make sure that people are safe when they're using platforms such as Zoom, and also more generally a coronavirus tech book as well. So, but that being said, even with these solutions, we can see that staff and students have little agency over their own personal data, and very much when it comes to higher education and online learning, there is a power imbalance there, and hence also questions of trust and transparency in terms of how people's data are being used for online learning, how long is it being stored for, and people are not necessarily aware of what the policies that are in place. So what we've tried to do is find a co-created and collaborative solution to protect data subjects in terms of their online learning, to make sure they have some form of agency and way of input into how their data is being collected and shared and stored and analyzed. And in order to kind of create that framework, we base our work on Eleanor Ostrom's research on the commons and taken some of the principles there. In consideration of creating a commons for online learning, we've taken to principles such as boundary setting. So make sure that we can identify community, understand what the norms are of the community in a way that is bottom up and inclusive. And in the context of online learning, we are actually able to see students or data subjects actually as students and not just as data points that we collect as part of the educational process or the academic experience. Polycentricity is also really important. And this recognizes that it's not just, for example, data protection laws, it's not just the technologies, it's not just Zoom and Microsoft Teams that they're using, but actually trying to understand how these different forms of governance, how these different disciplines interact with each other. And that helps us better understand the motivations and the actions of students, of data subjects as participants in the education space. So we actually can see how and to what extent their decisions are based on when they're deciding, whether or not they want to participate online, whether or not they turn their camera on, and whether or not they consent to tutorial recordings, for example. Ostrom also has a few design principles that govern the limitations of the commons and encourages iterative changes so that this common pool of resource can be better protected and better represent the community. So when we adapt some of those principles from the commons to create a data protection focused data commons, what we mean is that we hope that this framework can encourage collaboration and co-creation with data subjects to limit the harms of mass data collection, processing, and sharing of their personal data. And what this framework allows is what allows data subjects to do is to allow them to collectively curate, inform, and protect each other. And I'll explain a little bit more about how that works in application to our current study on online learning and show you examples of the tools in which that can be done. Importantly, no prior knowledge of the law or technology or privacy policies or university guidance is required. So everything is provided as part of the commons. and also to encourage that actually it's the use of the commons as a resource hub in that way. As part of the commons as well, data subjects, data protection outcomes are automatically generated from the system based on their own personal preferences. And so data subjects can follow that if they wish, but they can also update their outcome at their experiences and participate iteratively in the co-creation process to update their preferences as they go along, as they change throughout the course. So what does a commons look like? So a commons can support students by, in the example of online learning, by placing them in the center of the data protection process. And you'll see in the diagram that when data subjects, in this case students, participate in the commons, what considerations are take place. They can say what their specification and what their preferences are in terms of data protection. For example, if they say that, oh, I'm planning to share XYZ personal data, and if that's the case, then I don't want to be recorded, so forth. And within the commons, they'll also be able to share their experiences with other data subjects and other students, have access to research papers and regulations and policies and guidelines, but also be able to learn how to exercise their rights, for example, under the GDPR. And ultimately, at the end of the commons, or as part of the commons, there'll be there will be an output generated, an outcome generated that suits their own personal preferences as well. So when we're thinking about data protection specifically for the common good, we're aware and acknowledge that there are other data stewardship frameworks such as data trusts and data collaboratives that consider data protection as part of their framework and support data subject agency as well, particularly if they are developed in a bottom-up way, but none necessarily center data subjects with the aim of protecting their personal data based on their preferences, as well as support the remedy of data breaches as well, should anything go wrong. And in terms of commons more specifically, current commons focus on participation and co-creation by mitigating risks to data sharing, but not necessarily in the protection of data subjects' personal data. And so when we're thinking about creating a data protection focused data commons, what we want to do is to rebalance some of that power between data subjects and data controllers through collaborative solution building and community empowerment. And as I mentioned, to actually acknowledge participants as students and not just data subjects or not just students who kind of give their data as part of education and making sure that data is not distinct from students and their identity and their community and how they interact with each other in a learning environment. So in order to actually create a commons and assess whether it works, these are the three research questions that we ask. Firstly, we look at whether being able to interact with the commons actually helps inform students about the purposes of online learning and lecture capture and tutorial recordings, to see how effective the commons may be for actually supporting user preferences in protecting their personal data. And finally, we also would like to know whether our commons model actually encourages more transparency around data protection between different stakeholders. So what we did was we built an application. So we built a commons application that sits on top of Microsoft Teams, which is the online learning platform that we use at St. Andrews. And we're currently conducting a study to test this applications on university students in the UK, and I'll share some of our early findings for that. And we would also like to compare the willingness to consent for students to consent to tutorial recordings, the awareness of university data protection practices they have with and without the commons, and also some of their attitudes towards online learning and participating in tutorials online. So this is a overview of the study, and I'll go into a little more depth of the contents of the application and share with you some of the interfaces in the next few slides as well. So in terms of actually recruiting participants, what we did was we asked potential participants to fill in a short survey so we have a better understanding of what their background knowledge is in terms of university policies surrounding tutorial recordings and online learning, and also a bit more demographic information such as what year they're studying in and what subject, to see if that may have any impact on their attitudes towards online learning. Then they are randomly assigned to one of two groups. One is a control group that receives no resources or no access to the commons. And there's also the commons application group, which does have access to all of the resources, some of which are listed in the diagram. And after the Commons application group explores the contents of the Commons as a resource hub to interact and speak to other data subjects, everyone then is able to vote in a tutorial consent poll. And that's basically to say whether they consent or not consent to tutorial recording. And then finally, they will participate and do a second and final survey. So we have an understanding of what the Commons application group's experience was, what resources they actually found useful, and then assess their consent and also privacy comprehension to see how aware they are and what their attitudes may be towards privacy, and also to have a better understanding of what their online learning experience has been over the past academic year. So before I go into share some of our early observations, I would like to share with you some of the information that has been found in the Commons tool and what the Microsoft Teams application actually looks like. So as you'll see on your screen now, these are some of the, and this is the content that is available on the Commons tool. So first, there's a resource center with general information about university policies and current regulations that govern why and how universities record tutorials. Then there's a bit more information about GDPR data subject rights and how to exercise them specifically. A data protection quiz to help data subjects decide whether or not they want to consent if they're unsure, if they should or shouldn't. There is an interactive anonymous forum where students are able to chat to each other and ask other students anything about tutorial recordings and anything they're not sure about in terms of consent. And then finally, everyone has access to the consent poll tool for students, and this is the bit where they consent or not consent. So the control group from the study only has access to the consent poll tool and nothing else. So what does the Microsoft Teams application actually look like? So first, the students will see, the Commons group will see the screen with three buttons. So the FAQs, the consent helper quiz, and also the forum. And this is part of, this sits on top of a Microsoft Teams team. And ideally in a real life scenario, it would sit in the same team as the tutorial was being held. So before tutorials start, this is what users will see. And then if a student clicks through to the FAQs button, they'll see these 5 subsections at the top. So the first section involves voting information. So this is a bit more information about the consent poll. So this is information about how data from the consent poll is stored, who can see it, can they see the results, etc. So of course that they actually have a better understanding of the tool itself in addition to a wider university policies. Next, there is the rights section, and this section focuses on giving students the ability to find out more about what data protection rights and subject access rights that are offered under the GDPR and how they can actually exercise them. And we provide them with the templates to do that as well. And as you'll see, we've selected right of access, right to erasure, and right to data portability as part of the commons for tutorials and tutorial recordings. But of course, if we're looking at education more holistically, other rights may be applicable as well. The next bit includes the policy. So what are the university's actual policies? in terms of tutorial recordings, and then a bit more information about context. So if students and participants wanted a bit more information outside of the realm of tutorial recordings, but they wanted to find out a bit more about the GDPR, a bit more about the data protection rights more generally, and also look for external third-party guidance or information. And this is where they can find a bit more information about that. And then finally, as part of the FAQ section, there's also a bit more information about the quiz. And you'll have seen a little consent helper quiz button, but this FAQ section just explains that a bit more. But I have listed the questions that are part of the quiz on the slide here. So as you'll see, it deals with whether or not students plan to reveal sensitive personal information, are they avoiding certain topics or avoiding questions, will they actually rewatch the recording, and whether or not, and considering whether or not they think students themselves will think that a recording will affect the likelihood of them actually participating, and also questions about trust and responsibility there as well. You'll see from the quiz, if they answered 0 to 2 questions in a certain way, they may need to opt out. They may want to consider opting out if they answer a few more positively. And then if they answer even more than that, then we suggest that students may want to strongly consider opting out of lecture tutorings as not to impact their learning experience too much. And then finally, before the voting of whether or not to consent, and there's also an anonymous forum. And for the study, we use Padlet. And although Padlet, you can log in, you don't have to log in as part of Padlet, and Padlet doesn't also identify who the student is. And there's no way of finding that out through the tool either. And finally, this is the voting panel that everyone has access to. And everyone in the study votes in, and we ask them, should we record this tutorial? And it's a simple yes or no. And if only one person says no, then the tutorial won't be recorded in the study. So I want to just talk a little bit more about some of the early observations that we've seen as part of the study. And the first thing I want to talk about is consent levels. And so when we ask the question, and this relates to the tool that you would have just seen on the last slide, should we record this tutorial? Actually, from at the moment, 20 participants that have participated in our study, most students consented. So only 2 students actually decided not to consent. And at the end of the study, after the second survey, we also asked participants whether they would change how they voted based on the information that they read on the survey, because it may kind of result them in having a better understanding or better grasp of some of the privacy issues related to tutorial recordings, particularly if they are in the control group. And one person said that they would change how they voted, but actually they would change from not consenting to giving consent. So in total, all apart from one would actually still consent to tutorial recordings. So, and that raises the question of, how useful is consent for actually understanding online learning attitudes, or whether or not students actually understand what they're consenting to during tutorial recordings. So we decided to dig a little bit deeper and ask a few more questions. And so this brings us to kind of the second set of early observations that focus on the use of the Commons tool. So this specifically relate to the group that were a part of the Commons. Please excuse I think the blue lights that might be shining in, as there's an ambulance outside. But hopefully all is okay. But in terms of the Commons group, at least, so out of the 10 participants, everyone found that at least one of the Commons resource available on the Microsoft Team tool was useful. And so 6 participants agreed, and 2 participants somewhat agreed that they would use the Commons. So the majority would use the Commons to better protect their personal data. And they found that it was useful, or different aspects of the Commons was useful. And in particular, what was interesting was that information on exercising your rights was the section that participants found the most useful, which potentially suggests that students want to be able to have some form of recourse should they think anything bad would happen, or should there be a data breach that happened. And participants found from the Commons group that the actual act of consent or not consenting was the least useful, which kind of also demonstrates how their relationship with tutorial recordings and participating in tutorials as well. And from the group, from the control group of participants that participated in our study, some who said that they wanted more information on the recordings to help them decide, did actually suggest in free text that some of the resources that were available as part of the Commons group. And most of this information was outlined in the information on the university tutorial recording, as well as the FAQs section as well. So what we've kind of suggested or gathered is potentially that students do trust universities and staff with their data online, and participate, in particular, possibly also because of the power imbalance between students and their institutions, and not wanting to be locked out of education, and so potentially agreeing or consenting to tutorial recordings. But what is clear is that students do want more transparency and more openness about how, and to gain a better understanding of how data are collected and used as part of the online learning process. And so when we're trying to contextualize some more of this information, a final set of observations that I would like to share relate to tutorial content and participation in particular. So firstly, looking at the tutorial content and the topic, most participants out of all of the participants so far in the study have said that the actual topic of the tutorial has little or no impact to whether or not they consent to tutorial recordings. And when we asked why that may be the case, students have said that there are other more important factors to decide, such as whether or not they plan to rewatch the tutorial. And some also have said that they would consent regardless of the topic because it increases their accessibility, because they have disabilities or aren't able to follow the speech as quickly. And so having that recording is really helpful to actually increase their academic experience and their ability to excel in an online learning environment. However, in contrast to that, even though the actual topic didn't really have much impact, when we asked the participants whether or not they would avoid discussing any topics during online learning compared to physical classes, we provided them with a list of GDPR sensitive personal data, as noted in the law, but also allowed for free text. Out of all the participants, as you can see, sex life, data concerning a person, sexual orientation, and political opinions were topics they would actively avoid discussing in an online learning environment. And potentially, apart from sex life and sexual orientation, the fact that students aren't comfortable talking about data concerning a person, and that's whether it's themselves or someone else, on political opinions can have a great impact on class participation, because these two topics in particular do reflect quite a lot in sharing our personal experiences, and this isn't discipline specific as well, we found. And the reason why there is that contrast is that participants felt that they had control over the personal information and data they could share, so that even if a tutorial required them to share personal information, they would rather opt to not participate and not share their experience rather than not consent to a tutorial recording. So what this tells us as teachers, as lecturers, as academics, as people who run tutorials, is that we should consider how we engage with teaching some of these sensitive topics, or even engage in discussions or sharing of personal experiences when it comes to online learning, because it could have an impact on student participation. So even if they may want to participate in discussion, they may not feel like they can, or are less willing to, perhaps, as a result of the class taking place online. So those are some of our early observations. In terms of what's next for our work, as I mentioned, the study is ongoing. So we are continuing to collect some of this data and actually measure the extent to which data subjects find a data commons useful. But so far, the results have been positive, particularly in considering how we want students to feel like they're more informed about their decisions and have a better understanding of how institutions collect data during the online learning process. And when we're thinking about next steps and applying the Commons tool in practice, in real life scenarios, we're thinking about potentially including voting before and after tutorials so that participants and students don't feel constrained to what they say during a tutorial. But maybe more importantly, we should have considerations to think about moving away from consent as the legitimate basis for tutorial recording in the first place, given that at the moment it seems that students are more keen on actually understanding why and how their data is being processed, rather than the actual form of consent, or at least that linked to tutorial recording as well. And finally, to make the data protection focused data commons more useful, we hope to establish some policies around specific use cases and actually incorporating existing data protection requirements and encouraging a public consultation process to improve on design and functionality and collaboration aspect of the commons. So before I sum up, this is again a call to encourage your students to participate in our study. I've included the advert and the link below, but the more the merrier, and we do hope to get as wide of a range of students as possible, because we hope that it'll provide a more comprehensive understanding, particularly this time of year where students may be returning to in-person classes. Hopefully the study will provide a good opportunity for reflection as well in terms of students' online learning experience. Here are some of the references that we've included as part of the presentation. And finally, just to conclude, as we mentioned, existing laws, tech, and policies for online learning and online learning data generally focus on data management strategies as opposed to necessarily protecting data subjects' data during online classes or making sure that data subjects' preferences are being followed. And so we propose a collaborative and co-created data protection focused data commons to support better practices, more transparency, and hopefully rebalancing power between data subjects as students and data controllers for online learning. And we hope that the commons for online learning can improve data protection outcomes for students as data subjects and also improve their education experience. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to discussing and hearing some of your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Janis. That was such a really fascinating presentation, interesting both, I think, methodologically and substantively from my perspective. I certainly have a question that could get us started, but I'd like to remind everyone that there's also the chat and Q&A function that enables you to put forward any questions you might have or comments on Janis's wonderful presentation. To abuse my position as the moderator and ask a first question, Janis, I was wondering about the way in which you framed the decision making, which is the consent or not consent to the video recording as your kind of measure of preferences. In particular, it's kind of like a majoritarian decision making process as I understood it. And then you pointed at the end to the issues of accessibility, that there might be individual students who have a particular need or strong countervailing interest in having that recording. So I wonder how you thought about incorporating the kind of minority viewpoint or dissent within the within the design, or whether it's something you're thinking about more broadly.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess just start off with thinking about consent. The reason why we decided to use consent is that at least in St. Andrews and in a maybe perhaps more pre-pandemic environment, the university policy was opt-in, so it was opt-in to lecture recordings and tutorial recordings. Of course, in practice, whether or not that was the case to some extent dependent on each individual academic department or even each each academic that led those classes. And so we still felt that asking for consent was at least the current established way of assessing whether or not a tutorial should be recorded. And in terms of the actual study design, if in a group, in a tutorial group, if only one person said that they didn't want the tutorial to be recorded, then they won't be recorded. I mean, in an ideal world, hopefully, I mean, potentially there may be, more technological innovations that allow, only certain people to be recorded. And so, not students who don't want to be recorded to be shared. But, there are more kind of in-person ways of getting around this. So for example, in the computer science department, I believe students have been asked if they're happy to be consented and to be recorded, and those who do consent are put into one tutorial group. So only that tutorial group is being recorded, and that recording is being shared to everyone else. So I think there are both social and also technical solutions that kind of go around that aspect, particularly. And I think it's really important that we consider the accessibility issues as well. But I don't think there's any institution or any platform that has found the best way forward for that. And maybe I should also say that, even though we've conducted the study as part of the pandemic, we're not trying to kind of, make villains out of the institutions that, of course, have been trying their best to make sure that online learning has been accessible to everyone everywhere online. And so, we're conducting the study to have a better understanding of how students feel, particularly as they've been online for so long, as they're starting to perhaps think a bit more about these issues, or they've read some of the news articles that I've kind of screenshotted early on. But I think there's still a lot of questions, and I think there are, a lot of pockets of research being done to get a better understanding or find better solutions in this area as well.
Thanks, Janis. Really interesting. I suppose what it made me think of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Karen Levi's work on privacy interdependencies. And it made me think of that it's that same issue, because you founded your study on the GDPR, which, is not without its, let's say, flaws or perceived flaws. And in some ways, your study is very valuable because it highlights this challenge of interdependency. And so, yeah, it's the same flaw that we see within the regulatory regime itself, and it's really interesting to see this. You're grappling with it in a quite a pragmatic way and in a very contextual way that makes sense for the given students and the given institutions. Really interesting stuff. I don't think we've had another question come in yet, but I again have one more. Oh, and we have the shared link for participants and maybe all the members of the panel today. We can share it afterwards on social media with our followers to get the word out. I suppose another question which really follows on from that is partially to do with your framing of it and how the project seems to be a really valuable way to kind of educate students on the existing regime, their existing rights and the protective policies, etc., which are in place. I wonder to what extent, in educating students on the existing regimes, which some would argue are maybe insufficient, to what extent are you, trapped within then the GDPR's empowerment framework, which accepts that some monitoring is inevitable, that data is a resource that's up for economic exploitation. To some extent, are you're making good data subjects rather than resistors of your students? I wonder if you've given any thought to those kind of issues.
Yeah, I think it's tough, and I think these are ongoing discussions within EdTech, within e-proctoring, and kind of some of the activism and pushback with the use of some of these technologies, and and to take some of the debates and conversations going on there. One of the challenges is that in terms of making sure that some of these technologies that we use for, you know, the technologies we use for education, for example, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, weren't built for education. So they don't have, you know, university communities in mind, you know, and as much as it would be really nice to see some of these technologies developed, it's also not a sector that is particularly wealthy, or in the ways that we hope that the money that they have is being spent in certain aspects. So yeah, so there is a danger of, you know, just turning students into data subjects rather than asking them to challenge some of the technologies or pedagogies that are being used as part of education technology. But I think it is an important first step to raise awareness of some of these issues for students to actually understand some of these issues. And, you know, at the end of the day, those power imbalances will still continue to exist, because, you know, if they refuse to, you know, participate in an online platform, they will be locked out of their education experience. So it is tough, but I think that, you know, in thinking about tutorial recordings, but also online learning more generally, and thinking about how data should be governed, it kind of brings forward the conversation and also opens up new opportunities for you know, perhaps more ethical or more privacy preserving platforms to kind of step in.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think your answer to my question even shows that the platform itself could be a really valuable pedagogical tool to get students to work through those issues and to think about, were all the interests that they, you know, considered when they were making their decisions reflected in the GDPR's considerations, or are they thinking about, you know, their educational needs to a greater extent to their privacy or data protection needs. Really interesting. And so maybe one last question. Where would you like to see this in an ideal world with all the resources and all the time in the world? If you could scale this project up, what would your sort of dream data commons look like?
Oh, the dream data commons. Wow, that's a big question. I don't know, to be honest. I think, you know, and I think maybe, you know, this might not often be the case, but I think I don't know is maybe an appropriate answer, just because I think that, you know, ultimately a commons should be rooted in the community. So it's really hopefully the community that decides what they want to do. And, you know, maybe the community wants an uprising, you know, but maybe the community doesn't. Maybe they're quite happy within their existing norms and within their, you know, their current ways of working, that actually things work out for them. And, you know, there are, for example, Google Docs, as an example, you know, not as a commons, but as a way of participating in education, has been really, really fruitful for students. I know groups of students who will attend lectures, open the same Google Doc, and then work on it together. So that form of collaboration is really valuable. And, you know, if students are happy with it being free, knowing the sorts of data that big tech companies collect, and that's fine. But, you know, if students want to, particularly computer science students, maybe want to invest in kind of technologies that don't collect that vast amounts of data while still having those collaborative tools in the first place, then it should be up for them to decide. So I don't know, but I do believe that with the right tools and the right resources, that people and communities and groups are able to make informed decisions about what they want to see and how they want to be presented, both in the offline and the online world. So I leave this answer to the audience to think about, you know, how they want to kind of collaborate and co-create and participate within the communities that they're a part of in education or otherwise.
Well, what a wonderful answer and a wonderful thought to leave us on. I think, you know, you've given us a really fascinating talk, really valuable model for how we might think about these issues, how you can have community-based contextual norms evolve around these, you know, really difficult and emerging decisional practices. I think Patrizia is going to tell us a little bit about the next upcoming talk that that participants or viewers might like to attend. So I'd just like to thank Janis for a really excellent presentation, to thank all our participants today, and hand over to Patricia.
I hope you can all see the PowerPoint presentation I shared. So yes, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Catherine, for excellent moderation and excellent questions, and thank you, Janis, for a fantastic presentation, something I could really relate to as working as a lecturer at the University of Aberdeen in the past 2 years. My final job for today is to actually share information about our next enlightening talk that will take place on the 28th of October at the same time from 2 to 3 UK time. And the topic will be data protection law and online personalized pricing. The presenter will be Zihao Li, a PhD researcher at the University of Glasgow, and our moderator will be Fabrizio Esposito. So I hope we will see both of you may be there if you're interested in the topic. And I would like to thank you once again for preparing for today and for accepting our invitation. I wish you all a nice evening, and I hope everybody enjoyed the talk. With that, I think we can stop the recording, Zahao, and say goodbye for